pleasure to welcome you all to our session on immigration in Utah history. Glad you could be here. I am the child of immigrants, I might say. My family, however, was smarter than some immigrant families. They waited until the railroad was in to come. They couldn't imagine going across the country without a club car. Get serious. So they've been here a while, but not part of that hardy pioneer stock that maybe some of you are part of. I want to tell you a little bit about another immigrant, and then I'll tell you a little bit what we're going to do today. I've been spending a lot of time in the last year thinking about an immigrant named Joe Hill. He was actually Joel Emanuel Hoagland, then Joseph Hillstrom, then Joe Hill. He came to Utah on the railroad too, but he didn't come like my family in the club car. He hitched a ride without paying a fee and ended up in Utah in 1913, late 1913. And as you probably know, was accused of murder and executed almost 100 years ago today in what is now Sugar House Park. But Joe Hill represented in many things, but among them, he was part of that huge wave of immigration that came to the United States in the period after the Civil War between 1870 and 1920. That half century, upwards of 1 million people a year at times coming from all over. Historians call that the new immigration. That's because historians aren't all that bright. It isn't really the new immigration because we've had a newer immigration in the last 40 years. But they're similar in the sense that many of the people coming to Utah and elsewhere in the United States in that wave of immigration were coming from places they had never come from before to the United States. And I think we'll touch a little bit on some of that today. So I have a few things left over from the Joe Hill concert that we put on in Sugar House Park. Feel free to take one of our keepsakes. It's full of some wonderful photographs that I think you'll enjoy, so help yourself. Okay, they're going like hotcakes. I knew I should have charged for them. Anyway, help yourself. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The way we're going to do this, I've given each presentation 20 minutes, and at 15 minutes into it, I'm going to give them the old 5-minute warning. And I've told them that I'm going to do my best Chuck Barris imitation. When their 20 minutes is up, damn it, I'm going to hit that gong and pull them off. And hopefully we can keep on time, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. I'm sure we'll have some. So as I say, our session is Immigration in Early 20th Century Utah. I'm John Sillito. I teach history at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah. And I'm pleased to be here in part because past and current students are on the program as well. Let me introduce those folks. Lorrie Rands graduated from Weber State University in 2014. I was going to say finally, but that.
Thank you so much.
She graduated in 2014 with a BA in history. She's currently employed in the Special Collections Department at Weber State and is involved as the lead person, as she'll be discussing in a history of Ogden's 25th Street and Ogden immigration. Brian Whitney, who is currently finishing his Bachelor of Arts in History at Weber State, has interned with the LDS Church Historical Department. He's been involved in a number of things. He's also working in special collections, and most recently was hired by Greg Colford Books here in Salt Lake as a history editor, and he's on the board of the John Whitmer Historical Association, from whose meetings he has just recently returned. So we're glad to have Lorrie and Brian. Our second speaker, it's a little bit out of order from the program, but we moved it around a little bit. Our second speaker is Rochelle Kaplan, who came to Utah in 1998, she says, for love, and also she taught resource room at Granite High School until she retired. She began researching Utah's Jewish history when she helped co-found the Utah Jewish Genealogical Society in preparation for a presentation she made at the IAJGS, a convention that was held here in 2007, and then again in 2014. They must have had a good time, right?
Yeah.
Good. She's a former president and life member of the National Council of Jewish Women Utah Section, a life member of Hadassah, and currently a member of Congregation Kol Levi. Other interests include education, photography, writing, gardening, skiing, hiking, and politics. So that's kind of all. Eileen Hallet Stone is probably known to most of you because of her columns in the paper. Her award-winning projects include 19th and 20th century community stories and ethnic histories. You may be well aware of her most recent book, which is called Hidden History of Utah. And her earlier book, A Homeland in the West, Utah Jews Remember, was well received as well. In fact, a photo documentary exhibit from that book was part of the 2002 Winter Olympics. She's been involved in a number of other things, currently working on projects. So we are pleased to have these four fine scholars with us. We are pleased that their research fits so well into the overarching theme of this conference. And I'm going to now turn the time over to Lorrie and Brian with that caveat that at 5 minutes they're going to see his hand right here. Please.
All right. We're really excited to be here and talk about this project that we've been working on at Weaver State. This started out of a project called the 20th-Century Business of the Crossroads, wanting to document 25th Street and its history through oral history, which is something I absolutely adore. So as we were doing this project, we realized how many immigrants had come to Ogden and really were living in and around 25th Street. Why don't we do a project about them? And so we put a call out, and we were amazed at the response that we received. And at there were certain people we hadn't even considered, the Dutch, that said, "Hey, what about us?" So okay, we'll do the Dutch as well. And so it just turned into a wonderful project. So we're going to talk about some of these groups that we interviewed, and they're just short snippets because we interviewed quite a few people. So we're just going to kind of give you a brief synopsis of what we learned as we did this. And we're going to start with the Japanese community. What we discovered is that most of the first generation Japanese who came to Ogden, they refer to themselves as Issei. They came here specifically to earn money to buy land in Japan, because land there is so expensive. And what ended up happening is most of them just decided to stay here. But without fail, that first generation would either find a way to mail order bride, if you will, or go back to Japan to find a bride. That's how they did it. They didn't want to marry someone here. They would go home and find a spouse. And then they'd come back and continue their lives. And what they would do is they centered around, and this is kind of out of order, so forgive me. They centered around 25th Street, where they created a Buddhist temple on 24th and Lincoln. And that was their cultural center. The Buddhist church for them is more than just their religion. It's a part of who they are as a people. And so they centered their lives around this church, and they would hold their festivals. And most of them, because they didn't want to be farmers, that's what they were leaving from Japan, had businesses on 25th Street. And we discovered that the ones that wanted to be farmers, there was one family in particular, his life dream was to be a Japanese cowboy. He wanted that, and he had the whole get-up. His daughter remembers he had the bolo tie and the hat, and it's all he wanted was to be a Japanese cowboy, and he succeeded. He was able to buy land in Syracuse, and she remembers very fondly the New Year celebration. They would spend a few days just making the food and preparing, and then the women would stay home while the men traveled from house to house to celebrate. And she just thought, that's not fair. Why can't I go and enjoy what the men are enjoying? But it just wasn't what they did culturally. Their biggest struggle obviously came with World War II. And it was interesting to talk to them about that. Two of them we talked to were interred one was in Topaz, and the other was in Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And the one in Topaz, her name was Alice. She doesn't remember a lot about Topaz. She was just a little girl. But her cousin talks to her about it, and she related a story of being rounded up. They were living in Los Angeles or San Francisco, and being rounded up and going onto a bus to be taken to a special holding place before coming to Topaz. And they were being spit on and cajoled and just treated really badly. And one of the people said to them, why don't you go back to where you came from? And she thought, San Francisco? Great, can we go home? You know, they were Americans, they didn't understand. And the one who went to Heart Mountain, his name is Ray, he lost his father there. And they both said the reason they survived was because of their parents. Their parents made it livable. Am I taking too long? Okay, so here in Ogden, their struggles were different because they weren't rounded up like they were on the West Coast. Just the prominent members of the community. If they were a prominent, important member, they were rounded up. Except for there were a few exceptions. One was the owner of Kay's Noodle Parlor. He was so well known in the community, they just kind of, he's not a threat. We interviewed his daughter-in-law, but that made it fun. And then there were a few places they couldn't go. They weren't allowed to go to Pine View. They weren't allowed to go to the KLO radio station. You know, they might do something. It was just interesting to talk to them about their struggles, and most of them look back on it and, you know, it's just something that happened. And but you could tell with a few of them the struggles that they endured. The next group we wanted to talk to, he's trying to keep me on task.
A good
Yes, is the Tyroleans. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They come from a small little area which was Austria to begin with, and they came here they were so poor, extreme poverty. They came to Rock Springs, Wyoming to work in the coal mines, and eventually came to Ogden. But what I found interesting, much like the Japanese, they would mail home for brides, the first generation. They went back to their homeland to find brides. And Brian's going to step in and finish talking.
So the Tyroleans from the coal mines of Wyoming began appearing in Utah from 1910 through 1930. A major attraction was actually the Utah hot springs, which the Tyroleans believed were medicinal, and that they would visit to treat their afflictions and diseases that they contracted in the mines. Many settled in Ogden and West Weber, taking up farming in the rural areas and boarding houses in the city. The Central Hotel and the Empire Hotel of Ogden were both Tyrolean owned. The latter actually by two sisters, which I found interesting. The Kaleni family, as an example, operated the Belmont Hotel in the early 1920s before opening a grocery and fuel store in 1934. There were about 50 Tyrolean families that bought farms in West Weber, and they named it Little Tyrol for a while. Traveling into Ogden from the farms was typically limited to horse and buggy, so most families only made the trek a few times per year. And although they spoke fondly of their Mormon neighbors, some tension did exist through the Prohibition era, as the Tyroleans were rumored to be bootleggers. Some of these rumors were true. Yeah. The interviewee that we had, David Prevedel, who actually authored a book on the Tyroleans, recounted one story where a truck that was used for bootlegging whiskey was hastily covered up by haystacks prior to federal agents appearing and poking around with sticks. But it was really the children who felt the brunt of the prejudice, as Mormon kids would either avoid them or would ridicule them for their accents, their food, or their ethnicity, often referring to the Tyroleans as wops or dagos. In 1937, 50 Tyrolean families came together to form the Friendly Club, which was actually in a vacated Del Monte canning factory in West Weber. This became the social center of Tyrolean life from 1937 to 1965, holding regular dances, weddings, receptions. Another social event that was important to maintaining their cohesion was Canyon Days in Ogden Canyon. It was an annual Tyrolean gathering where the smell of polenta and ravioli filled the air, along with old world dancing, games, and laughter. They maintained a sense of cultural identity within the first and couple two generations, but began assimilating by the third generation. The first two generations, while they held tightly to their Tyrolean heritage, began to phase out. When we asked our interviewee why this was, he responded, "Well, we all started marrying Mormon girls." Blonde Mormon girls, actually. That was important. Next, we're going to move to the Greeks. The Papa George family, who's fairly well known out here in these areas, So we had an opportunity to interview them. Alexander, or Alex Papa George, arrived in Utah in 1910 from Argos in Greece, where his family raised olives and tobacco. Two of his brothers had previously come to the United States and found work. Not fond of tobacco farming, Alex decided to set off for the New World. He first worked on railroads before opening a confectionery on 25th Street. Besides candy, Alex also sold liquor from his confectionery, because candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. His brothers eventually returned to Greece, and he intended to do likewise until he met Anastasia, a young woman from the Greek island of Lemnos, whose family had immigrated to Ogden in 1915. After they married in 1926, Alex purchased a few acres of land in Far West and took in not only his new bride, but also her parents as well as her 4 brothers. Over time, Alex gave up the confection and liquor business and determined to go full-time into farming, believing that it would be a preferable environment for raising his family. Just as the farm was becoming sustainable, however, the Great Depression hit. Falling behind in their mortgage payments, the family was able to keep their property through one of the New Deal programs administered by Roosevelt. And as can be imagined, afterwards they became staunch Democrats.
Yeah.
The family lived on subsistence and cash farming through the Depression and the Second World War. Alex joined with the local dairy farmers in creating the Cream of Weaver Co-op. Some people may be familiar with that. Although he struggled with his English, Alex earned a reputation as having a good eye in appraising livestock, a job that he continued well into his 80s. The youngest Papa George, Harry, runs the family farm today. It's one of the few independent family-run dairies left in the region. Another sibling, Jimmy Papa George, became Far West's first mayor. He ran as a Democrat, of course. During the 1950s, the Papa Georges were instrumental in bringing the Greek Orthodox parish into Ogden. Their religious identity really remained critical to retaining their cultural identity as Greeks. But beyond their cultural identity, the Papa Georges credit the farming community for their success. Pulling together during the lean years and during the harvest seasons, the farmers of Far West created an uncommon bond that he said transcended ethnic, political, and religious differences in a spirit of mutual cooperation. Next, we'll discuss the Basques.
5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes left. Wow, that was quick. Your introduction is included in this. The Basques inhabit the northwest part of Spain and southwest part of France. And according to the Maruris, they've been there for a long time. In fact, according to cultural myth, the Basque language, which apparently has no known origins, might even have been the original language of Adam and Eve. When the Spanish government began sequestering Basque men into the military, Saturnino, or Sam Maruri, arrived in Utah in 1912. The 18-year-old took up work with Kennecott Mines and was a boarder here at the Royal Hotel for 7 years, a hotel that he would end up running ultimately. Josefa Osa, who would become his wife, immigrated when she was 15 years old with her sister, arriving at Ellis Island, she said, as a frightened young woman who spoke no English and would hold out her hand with money in it, trusting that the Americans would take what they needed for boarding and for food. She was originally going to go off to California, had a layover here in Ogden, where she bumped into Sam at the Royal Hotel, was completely smitten, and they were married shortly thereafter. Sam became a man of repute in Ogden, running not only the hotel's books, but a few side jobs such as selling liquor, and also shark loaning.
Also what?
Loaning money,
Oh,
shark loaning, yeah. The family recounted numerous times that federal agents would show up and they would have a mad scramble to hide the liquor before they would unlock the door. But still, running a non-segregated hotel during a period of segregation in Ogden was a big deal. And they became known as a center of multiculturalism in Ogden. One last story on them, they recalled a baby was left on their doorsteps. A black baby was abandoned, left on their doorsteps for them to take care of, I think trusting that it was a safe place. They took the child in and raised her for about a year before social services was able to find her permanent housing. They named her Jeannie Royal, Jeannie Royal is actually still alive today. And in 1980, she was able to reconnect with the Maruri family, and she still goes by the name Jeannie Royal. So I thought that was a touching story. All right, we'll finish up with the Jewish.
About 3 minutes.
Great.
Okay.
Dutch.
Okay, so we're gonna kind of go really quickly through this. The last group we want to talk about were the Dutch. And mostly the Dutch who immigrated to Ogden were Mormon converts. But we found two families that were not. One was the Longeveld family. They came here in 1948 and remember the occupation of Amsterdam. In fact, Rhea, the oldest daughter, talks about that and was just, you could feel her horror as she tried to recount how it felt to be there. And her father brought them here because he didn't think they could survive Stalin. He didn't realize Stalin wasn't going to take Amsterdam, but he was sure it was going to happen. And I want Brian to really talk about the next family, so I'm going to be quiet and let Brian talk about the one Jewish family that we managed to find, who happened to be Dutch.
So, born in 1930 in Amsterdam and raised in the Jewish section of the east side of the city, Jerry Meets began noticing that his friends were disappearing by 1943. He said that the last big roundup was over 5,000 citizens removed from his neighborhood by German forces. His father spent 13 weeks in a labor camp before managing to escape and return home, where they went into hiding. To sustain his family, Jerry began stealing whatever he could, and he recalled eating everything they could to stay alive, including tulip bulbs, raw sugar beets, and even cats and dogs. 20,000 died of starvation during this period in Holland. Shortly after being liberated from occupation, Jerry joined the Israeli army. And it was a few years after that that he was sponsored by the International Social Services to come to Utah. He relocated here, although he said he found it difficult to integrate with the Dutch community. He had trust issues. He couldn't trust them, and he still felt the sting of anti-Semitism here in Utah. So I hope that we're going to have more positive Jewish stories after this, but Jerry's story doesn't end on a particularly positive and upbeat note. While interviewing him, and I'll end with this, while interviewing him, he was proudly displaying the Israeli flag in his home. And I asked him what, if he could teach us anything from his experiences and legacy, it would be, and he said, we need to learn not to hate because hatred can kill.
Yes.
Right, thank you.
Rochelle,
No, because you don't. No, okay.
don't change on me.
You know that the Japanese did the ever-bearing strawberry. They're the ones who cultivated the ever-bearing strawberry in Utah. Yes, and the white celery.
Oh.
And they used to have white celery. It would be really great to learn more about that because the white celery went everywhere, to Washington, D.C., everywhere. This is just an interlude.
Yeah. That's really neat. In our research, we found some of them were sharecroppers out of Syracuse
Yes, yes.
because they couldn't go home.
Yeah.
Initially mattered, and they we were trying to be good. Sorry.
Okay.
You ready?
I think so.
Okay. I guess so.
In the interest of time, I'm gonna cut that short, but I did want to mention, and this was before I heard Pam Perlick's wonderful lunchtime speech, but talk, but and I realized how many discounted Utahns, Americans there were, and others and blacks too. But just to point out that the population of Utah, according to the census papers, doubled every 10 years from about 1850 to 1860 to 1870. In 1900, there was a population of about 270,000 Utahns, of which 5,000 were Jews. And 110 years later, there's still about 5,000 Jews, but the population is 2.7. So Jews were, although they still have influence here, they were really a powerful force earlier on in Utah's history. And I'm going to talk more about the earliest Jews because of time constraints, but there's a lot of later stories too. So you that Jews did live all over the state. One of the reasons that Jews, and they were considered Gentiles, as they still are in the state, was that Brigham Young felt that the only suitable vocation for Mormons was agriculture. So that opened up trade, and then he was also against Mormons being engaged in mining, at least at first. And so when mining came in 1870, that also created opportunities. There was a vibrant Jewish press in English, based in San Francisco and Cincinnati, and this was a way to give information and to get information about Jews around, and news of interest to Jews, locally, nationally, internationally. So here's a letter from Sarah Geller thanking the Hebrew Sabbath Visitor for her subscription, because she says she's the only Jew, she's a member of the only Jewish family among Christians and Mormons. That's from 1879. Jews, like others early on, had three main routes to Utah. Of course, most of the Jews who came first came from Europe, from Bavaria, Prussia, Germany, from that area. So once they got to the East Coast, some of them traveled into Billings, Missouri, and then traveled overland to Utah. Other ones went through the Isthmus of Panama. There was no Panama Canal then, so I had to trek through the jungles, then get a boat on the other side and go up to California and then inland. And the most arduous, or longest trip, I can't say it was the most arduous, but the longest was around South America and then up the Pacific coast and then inland to Utah. And of course, they came like other people did, for adventure, a better life, mobility, recreation of their identities. So one of the most notable early Jewish families from Prussia were the Auerbachs. That's probably, I moved here in '98, but probably some of you may remember the Auerbachs department store.
That's where we bought all our school clothes when I was a child. We lived near the Valley Fair Mall, and his was the only one close by for where we lived.
Thank you. So there was a third brother who did come to Utah and was active also in the Jewish community, but he ended up moving to New York. He was Theodore, and then there was the second generation. So they did end up owning Auerbachs and developing into a great department store, of which I have wonderful pictures. And I really should thank Nelson, because the Utah State Historical Society provided me with just a lot of these fabulous
And
pictures.
it's the staff down there and all the
Yes,
donors over
yes,
the years, not
yes.
me.
Amazing place. So, anyway, I'm going to move on. But the Auerbach brothers did go to California first, set up a dry goods place, moved to Salt Lake in 1863, and Brigham Young helped them find a place on Main Street. Their store in Ogden in 1869, known as the People's Store, a little bit later. I did come across a quote from Fred Auerbach saying that that their institution was threatened. They had been doing great until Brigham Young decided to have the Mormons establish CCMI and encourage Mormons to shop at only Mormon-owned stores. But with the advent of mining, the business was able to thrive. Just some more pictures. There's the stores that, I guess, as it was later on, closed in 1977. Okay, then the first family that's, Jewish family that's considered to be the first family in Utah, was originally Bruck from Silesia, Fanny and Julius Brooks. She was actually his niece. He went back to Silesia, maybe to find a bride, I don't know, but he was telling stories about the Wild West in the United States, and she was mesmerized, and they got married and came here. They first went to Salt Lake in 1854 to stay the winter, but then they went on to California and Oregon, but they came back to Utah 3 years later, took in boarders. She had a millinery shop. You may recognize that from downtown Salt Lake. It's the Brooks Arcade. The outside still looks the same. This is from 1920. Samuel Auerbach married Evelyn Brooks, and they bought this and named it in honor of Julius Brooks. Okay, and often there were brothers who came over together. So another set of brothers were the Rands brothers from Germany. And they started out as traders and grocers really early. 1858, they were dealing with trading with 1864, when the U.S. Army was leaving, NS Rands sold the entire pork supply from the Army to Brigham Young for $30,000. Here's a picture of the Rands. N.S. Rands founded the first Masonic lodge. I'll talk a little bit more about the lodges later. He helped found the first Jewish congregation here, B'nai Israel. And he also helped found the Liberal Party, which I guess was the earlier counterpart to the Progressive Party and later the Democratic Party. Here's a very early picture of Rands-Hoffs. Can you see it in the left-hand corner? That's 1864 on Main Street. And there were other Jewish firms then too. Siegel and Company, Bodenberg and Kahn, as well as the Rands-Hoffs. You can find pictures of those. Here's another article or a little story from the Salt Lake, rather from the Jewish press. This is a newspaper called The Hebrew. And it noted that there were 20 Jewish men in 1865 in Salt Lake and 2 families. And enough to have a minyan, which is like a quorum. You need 10 males to have a Jewish prayer service. And I'd love to tell you about the other ones who formerly Jews who embraced Mormonism, but I don't have time. But it did work both ways. There was some intermarriage, not much. Some conversion, not much. Here's another article from the Hebrew and a letter, just giving news about Salt Lake, saying, talking about Jews in Salt Lake asking for a meeting of Israelites as Jews were then known, and also describing the first High Holy Day services, which just ended here last week. So this is in 1865, and Brigham Young actually lent a hall for Jews to have their services, and people came from as far away as Montana Territory, traveling 400 miles for the service. Whoops. Okay, one of my favorite families is the Popper family. If you're from Salt Lake, you might have heard of Parkerton Park. That's named after Charles Popper on the land where he had his stockyards. He was the first Jewish rancher in Utah and the first non-Mormon butcher in Utah. And when he closed the shop for the High Holy Days, out of respect, the Mormon butchers also closed their shops, and he reciprocated by closing his shop on Pioneer Day. So there was a lot of good feeling there. He bought 150 acres of land in Dry Canyon that became known as Popperton. He had a slaughterhouse there. He had a soap and candle factory. He had a lot of ranch lands along the Utah-Colorado state line, and was one of the largest raisers of beef. They did move to New York with their children in the mid-1880s, but he came back every year to look after his interests here and said this is where his heart was. He was considered, here's another article from another little bit from another Jewish newspaper, the American Israelite, where he is cited as the most influential Jew of Utah Territory. This is from 1879. I should tell you one other quick story, and that is that he actually sued the Interior Department and the U.S. government for 25 years to regain control of that land around Popperton that had been seized from him. He felt illegally, and he actually moved his family to D.C. And he did finally win. It was the only time that there was a law that was written that gave him back the land under Grover Cleveland's administration. And he actually later became the mayor of a resort town in Maryland, Chesapeake Bay. But that's another story. Let's see. Oh, so this is from the Pioneer Jews of Utah, this quote. This is not actually his butcher store, but the quote is about his store. And it says that during the winter season, they would have these whole carcasses of bear and deer, and they would decorate them with colored paper and ribbons for the festival. This is a store in Denver. They did a similar thing. So as I said, he came back every year. So this was an article from the Salt Lake trip of 1906. And he's recounting, his love of Utah and hoping that it's going to be #1 in the United States. And he also recounts this hysterical story, which I had time to read, but he talks about how they used to be drag racing down Main Street for money, for purses, and Brigham Young with the ladies would watch. And it got so raucous that they had to try to put an end to it. But they really couldn't because it was so much fun that people gladly paid the fine to get in. This is the hotel he stayed at, which is no longer in existence when he came back. Okay, another set of brothers were the Waters brothers, from whom Salt Lake Mayor Ralph Becker is descended. They were from Prussia. They had Salt Lake City's first jewelry store in 1866 on Main Street. And Eichel was the treasurer of the Hebrew Benevolent Society, which is like a social Jewish organization to help people in need as well as serve a social function. That was established in 1866. He was also a charter member of the first congregation, which I had mentioned earlier, B'nai Israel. And he conducted services there with somebody else on a weekly basis before there was a rabbi. He and his wife were actually married at Charles Popper's home. Okay, this was a tragic story that appeared in the Salt Lake Herald of 1893. They had 7 children, and in 1893, in the space of 2 weeks, they lost 3 of their children to diphtheria. And there were many epidemics because the more precise treatment and shots didn't really develop until the 1900s. But one of his surviving sons, Leon, here pictured with Einstein, actually became a chemist and who specialized in sanitary inventions and health, public health. And you have to think that because of his family's tragedy that this steered him in that direction. He wrote The Pioneer Jews of Utah. He was a professor at BU who established a chemistry scholarship which still exists today. He set up the atomic lab at Caltech, which astonished my husband to graduate from there. And he developed portable disinfectors in World War I and mobile hospital units used by the British in World War II. Another set of brothers were the Cohn brothers, and they were from Poland. He was actually elected to the city council in Salt Lake in 1874 and re-elected. He was a member of the Alta Club, which actually was started by Gentiles. Mormons were not allowed at first, or weren't encouraged anyway. It was founded by Jews and other Gentiles. And ironic, because later Jews weren't allowed. Life is complicated. They had a dry goods store. Here's his brother. His brother was actually elected president of the congregation B'nai Israel in 1896, and his brother married sisters. Yet another set of Jewish brothers were the Siegel brothers. Just a few more sets of brothers to go. On the 1870 census, he's listed as owning a retail clothing merchant. As owning a retail clothing store. By 1866, there were 2 stores in Salt Lake City. They were from Bavaria. They were 3 brothers. They came to America with their grandfather, settled in Baltimore first. Then they would follow the trains and follow the movement west, Dakota Territory, Montana, and then came to Utah. There's Saul Siegel. I think he's kind of cute. And there's Henry Siegel. And interesting, a lot of the brothers who had retail stores or had other businesses also got involved in mining and discovered, So anyway, Henry was an incorporator of that first synagogue and its first president. And he owned, with his brother, Siegel Mining Company. And here's an ad from 1897 for their clothing company. And I'm not getting very far. Here's an early picture of their company, their store. A later picture. The Kane family, also 2 brothers. This is the wedding certificate in Montana Territory of Samuel Kane and his bride. And they got involved in wholesale groceries. Emmanuel Khan was an officer of the First Congregation, and you may recognize the anniversary bed and breakfast. That was Emmanuel Kane's home. It's on East Town. Here's a 1905 picture of the wholesale grocery outfit, which got even larger. And when Samuel died, an ad was taken out in the American Israelite saying that he was really responsible for getting the congregation, the early congregation in Salt Lake together. The Simon brothers, I don't know if any of you remember the Paris store. but they established it. They were wholesalers and manufacturers of millinery for decades. They also were offices of Congregation for Israel, and Fred was the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce, who, when people tried to deny Mormons entrance in the, because of their polygamy, he vouched for them, saying, you know, where does this stop? So, and he had a beautiful quote, but I'm going to skip that. But he was very tolerant. So here's the Paris store, early, and as it expanded. When it expanded, there was a big store, thousands came, and all this were played in the balcony, and every woman who entered was given roses. I wish it was still around when I moved here. Okay, Corinne, Utah was founded just right near where the promontory of Utah, where the two railroads came together to form the Transcontinental Railroad, and it was founded largely by non-Mormons. As a fact, no Mormons lived there, the thousand people. And it was Utah's second largest city for 10 years, and then became a ghost town. But that was the beginnings of the Liberal Party there. They had all kinds of businesses, both kosher, I should say, and non-kosher, things like an opera house and a theater, but also brothels and gambling houses. So the Liberal Party was popular and did win elections, and it did, they did win, after they won elections, they developed Salt Lake City's first sewer line and the city and county building, which you see every single time you come downtown. Fred Kiesel was an early Corinne resident who later moved to Ogden. A lot of people from Corinne either moved to Salt Lake or moved to Ogden. He later became the mayor of Ogden. Your stories. Simon Bamberger was the United States' second Jewish governor after Moses Alexander in Idaho. This was during the Progressive era, the only Jewish governor of Utah. He made, with his brothers, fortunes in lots of areas, and he founded Lagoon Park as well as making fortunes in mining and railroads. So just some pictures of Sillito. There's a lot of wonderful pictures, but here he built the train to go to Lagoon. Okay, here's a census, an early census from 1870, and this whole page in Ogden is all Jewish names. Okay, the probably most famous Ogden Jew was Abe Kuhn, and also with his brother. They started out as fur traders and then developed stores. But when he was 90, he told of his adventures with his brother, where they would go to Montana buy gold dust, then disguise themselves as beggars, beg for food so they wouldn't get robbed, sell it for a really good price in Denver, go to New York, buy clothing, and then bring it back. Okay, I'll just talk about a few Jewish miners. The most famous is Samuel Newhouse. There's lots of stories about all of them, but I'll talk about Samuel Newhouse. Here he is. And he was already a millionaire when he came here from making a fortune in railroads and mining in Colorado and real estate. And he's the father of copper mining here. He realized, first he came here to mine gold, but there was no gold, there was copper, or not enough gold. And but with the dawn of electricity, he said, copper mining's a good thing. So he built Utah's first skyscrapers. I'll show you some pictures. And he also bought Copperton Place, and is now Copperton Park. And he actually developed a town with houses, free housing, gardens for his workers. Newhouse, Utah, his brother, Canyon. He also developed this commercial district downtown, and he was a philanthropist. So he was nominated for vice president in 1908. Here, I love this picture. So here, the Boston and Newhouse buildings going up, and you can see what was there before. This is going up. So the scale is just so vast, much vaster. The commercial building. Then he decided to build a 13-story hotel, the Newhouse Hotel. Unfortunately, World War I intervened, and so he had financial reversals, and he couldn't finish the hotel. So there was a joke on the vaudeville circuit that it was the best ventilated hotel in the West. But it was eventually finished. Of course, now it was demolished in the 1970s or 80s, I think. I'll just show a few pictures of his house. He had. Oh, I should also tell you, for those of you who know New York, he also developed and built the Flatiron Building in New York on 23rd Street. luxurious housing, and he set a speed record going on, trying to catch the Lusitania, a speed record on railroads, trying to get to New York to sail on the Lusitania to visit his dying brother. One other miner who was a founder of the Alta Club was Abraham Hanauer, and it's his first president, and he also had a cattle company. Oh boy, I'm gonna have to, okay, I'll just finish up this. There's many more stories, but here's the Alta Club.
Oh, I love her.
Anna Rich Marks, she was a woman miner, mine owner, who was very quick with her tongue and a gun. And she made a fortune in mines near Eureka in the Tintic area, and also in real estate, and also in Lorrie. One more thing, I'm going to move to a brewer, Jacob Moritz. He was the president of B'nai Israel in 1905. He realized that beer was, Salt Lake City was a great place to develop beer, and so he started the Salt Lake Brewing Company. He has an early sign. I could tell you stories about that. He also decided to build a business block in addition to what the Mormons business district. And when he died in Germany, he was worth a lot of money. And I'll just mention these fraternal lodges. There's also the Independent Order of Oddfellows, started by Jews and other Gentiles, as well as the Masonic Lodge. Here's an early ad from 1876. The IOF building, which still stands, although it's on the other side of the street now and turned around. They also started benevolent associations. I'll just skip that, and I'll just mention the synagogues. So B'nai Israel was followed by Montefiore. They existed at the same time. Montefiore was followed by poorer and more Orthodox Russian Jews who moved here and got involved in mining and scrap metal. And then those two have combined. They combined in 1972 to form Columbia, which I'm a member. And then Jews being Jews, a group of Bolsheviks split off from Montefiore and formed Shaare Zedek, and Bamberger laid the cornerstone of that. And then there's Brit Sholom, which is the oldest existing continuing synagogue, which is in Ogden. And now there is a synagogue as well in Park City. So I probably should stop there, yes? Okay, thank you.
And Payson to Bamberger.
Sorry?
There was a train that went from Ogden to Payson, and they called it the Bamberger.
Okay.
Yeah,
That was a fabulous. It went right down to Salt Lake and all the way up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
for just a very little amount of money. That's what my family told me.
Well, I'm not having time to pass this around, but when you're through, you can go up there, please look, but you have to know there is a Jewish cowboy, there was a Jewish cowboy, probably is a Jewish cowboy today, so some of these pictures are up here. That was very good. May I close this? Is it okay?
It's okay
Do you
with
mind?
me.
Is that okay? Okay. So I'm gonna talk like a bat out of hell. I hope I can get it all done. I'm sorry, I swear. I'm from Boston and Maine, that's what I do.
I'll raise you 5, I'm from New York.
You can always best me.
Go Sox.
Yeah, but I hold my own, but you do too. Picture this, 3 miles northwest of Gunnison in Sanpete County, there was located one of the largest Jewish agrarian colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains. It took root in 1911 and it failed, but it was not for lack of trying. It was marginal land. It was at the foot of the mountains. It was semi-arid, desolate, steep, rock-studded, and spare. Do any of you know where Gunnison is?
Yes.
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. There were rolling tumbleweed and sagebrush. Yet for a brief time, this rough land was the settlement of hope and promise called Clarion. And it was composed of immigrant families instilled with the belief that agriculture will make laborers instead of paupers, and bread producers instead of bread beggars. Between 1880 and 1920, 2 million Eastern European Jews emigrated to America's urban cities, poor and overwhelmed by teeming streets, slums, sweatshops, congested tenements, crime and economic oppression. Some yearned for greener pastures. They listened intently as activists praised the virtues of farming and the Back to the Land movement. That's what I'm talking about today, getting back to the soil. Russian immigrant and activist Benjamin Brown, you might know him because he and a Mormon partner later produced Norbest turkeys. He was the backbone of Clarion. He reasoned that such colonies would free Jews from urban ghettos and provide them opportunities opportunities to become self-reliant and to prosper. According to Professor Robert Goldberg, who wrote Back to the Soil, in the shtetls, do you know what shtetls are? Small towns, sometimes comprising 100 people, sometimes several thousand people. In Europe, in the shtetls of Europe, Jews were forbidden to own land, and very few were farmers. Immigrating to America, Clarion was destined to become their trumpet call, their shofar, which is made from a ram's horn, calling them out of the city and back to the land, back to their roots. Under the umbrella of the newly formed Jewish Agricultural and Colonial Association, Brown spoke to people in Yiddish. Do you know what Yiddish is?
It's a language.
It is a language, but it's made of Ashkenazi Jewish, from their language of being Yiddish, German-based, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Slavic languages, all put together. My grandmother spoke it, never wanted us to know, so they could always talk about things we shouldn't know. We still don't know. He talked to groups in Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. He paralleled the importance of working together as farmers with improving the economic future for American Jews, combating anti-Semitism, and creating goodwill among Christian neighbors. His speeches and compelling charm appealed to working people of all kinds, from accountants, peddlers, clerks, to plumbers, stonemasons, electricians, and those representing different branches of Judaism and political affiliations, such as religious Orthodox and atheists, socialists, Zionists, communists, and nationalists. Religion and politics would remain a private affair in Clarion. They had work to do. No arguing about religion, no arguing about politics. The agrarian settlement, composed of privately owned homes, provided collective support for cultivating fields, buying farm equipment, and selling the colony's goods and produce. He sought 150 to 200 young men, each one hoping to produce $300 to go into this venture. That would total a capital of $60,000, with which they would purchase land, livestock, and building supplies and equipment. Fascinated by Brown's vision, many such men enthusiastically joined the association. They attended agricultural classes. They learned how to work the land. They read about working the land. Of course, you know, not until you're on the land will you really work the land. Right. But they were convinced that this was good. They even convinced their families to loan them money, because this was getting them out of the ghettos right onto the free land, unoppressed land. The colonists in the meantime would be paid $15 a week for their work. In early 1911, Brown and a partner, Isaac Herbst, a socialist and civil engineer, headed west seeking to find the land for such a large settlement. They went to other places, but when they got to Utah, they were shown this land, this arable land in the south central Utah, and they were elated. 5 miles long, 3 miles wide, and a half mile from the Sevier River, the 6,000-acre parcel stretched out below the state-promised Paiute Canal. And notice that I say state promised. State water coming, maybe, promised. The association bought the property and the water rights at a public land auction. They paid nearly $69,000, 10% down, 10-year balance due. Clarion's proximity to Gunnison's railroad line was a plus. Denver and Rio Grande Railroad offered direct transportation to Salt Lake City and beyond, all the way to the east. They could get their produce out there, everywhere, from the west to the east. They could also use that depot at Gunnison to pick up all the newcomers who were arriving to take part in Clarion. Some of them were dressed in city clothes and carrying umbrellas. They'd arrived by train, and they were bewildered by the enormity of open space. You're talking about people in closed, small tenement. All of a sudden, my gosh, there it is. Everywhere they could look was land. Opportunity was fabulous. Colonist David Bernstein's son, Harry, never forgot the experience. He said, when it was decided that our family was going to Clarion, the effect upon us had an aura of a dreamlike sense of adventure and excitement, a wonderful faraway place full of hope and promise. He wrote this in his memoirs. By 1912, our family had grown to 6 children, the oldest being not me. The trip, which took 3 days, was memorable. leaving our drab home, boarding one of the most luxurious trains of those days, and watching the fascinating scenery pass us as we traveled exceeded anything we could have imagined. Another colonist, Moishe, was astonished at the sight of unrecognizable friends. He showed up, and all these men meeting him at the depot were all sunburned. He didn't know who he was talking to. He said, "I think I know you, I'm not sure." And then someone said, you know me? You've known me for 10 years. "Oh my gosh, is that you?" But he didn't say, "Oh my gosh." And they embraced. By 1911, 12 emigres led by Brown arrived in Sanpete County to clear land, plow, plant, harvest, and cultivate a new life for an intended 300 Jews. 2 men had farming experience. Others were chosen for leadership, qualities, and knowledge of animal husbandry. There are only a few of them. Construction and field work. They planned a main road, and they subdivided the land into 40-acre homesteads for the first 50 colonists. They built a communal barn, and they pitched 4 large tents in the meantime for living in, and dining, and sleeping. They hauled in water from Gunnison, that was no mean feat, and they purchased a modern tractor for tilling. In fact, according to the Gunnison Gazette, on September 15, 1911, the advance guard was quite busy having in operation a large gasoline-powered plow, which is made to do a capacity of 20 acres a day. The plow was adjusted by a firm in Gunnison, which made the sale, and being the first to be brought into this section, attracted quite a big crowd of people. Well, there was a problem with the tractor, because nobody knew how to use it. You could use it until it fell apart, and then you would not know how to bring it back. Clearing the land of rocks, though, the new farmers discovered that the soil, considered choice, was anything but choice. I think many of you might know this. The area, the gravelly, sandy loam, was underlain with an impervious layer of clay-like subsoil. I feel like that's out in Sugar House where I live. Large parcels of land sloped steeply. Others were too close to ravines to be developed into productive fields. Governor William Spry sent advisors from the Utah State Agricultural College to instruct the colonists on dry farming, irrigation techniques, crop selections. Mormon neighbors in Gunnison, whose fields teemed with alfalfa, sprouts, oats, wheat, lent a helping hand. The early colonists, though, were so charged with this that they greeted each sunrise with song and labor, and every sunset with restfulness and spiritual happiness. Isaac Friedlander, one of the original 12, described their enthusiasm. Today, one man at the supper table tells me that for the first time, he plowed a large area with the help of an 8-horse team, and Joseph Furman called the 15er. The reason he was called the 15er was he wore size 15 shoes. He often declared, "Let us make a good go of it here, and you'll see the whole Jewish people returning to the land." By fall, the men had cleared 1,500 acres for spring planting. Am I on time?
Yeah.
Am I okay? Because I'm reading as fast as I can. They dug irrigation ditches, and they waited for the first sign of greening. Enthralled by the new surroundings, Friedlander extolled the sights and colors of autumn, meadow grasses that he said glistened gold in the sunshine, so radiant. The mountain walls, he said, were tinged in hues, rose and yellow. Late afternoons were of blueness, and gigantic trees grew so tall they made them moths by comparison. He loved it there. In winter, the colonists encountered setbacks. Heavy snowfall often cut off their connection with Gunnison. They couldn't shop for the staples. They couldn't go to the mail post office. They couldn't hear news from home, and they needed that news from home. They were not told about Sanpete County's short growing season. Neither were they told about the weather. They believed it was mostly temperate. They left most of their warm clothes at home. They also faced economic crisis. The association's resources were running out. Goods bought on credit were now due. The state's first installment for the land was called in. And fortunately, Brown, gosh, he was such a brave guy. His spirit never wavered. He rushed back east. He solicited more funds. He recruited more association members, and returned to Clarion with nearly $6,000. He had to have done that just within a couple of weeks. The state deferred payment for another year. The funds were redirected into the colony's coffers, and a relieved community was given the financial go-ahead for the following spring. Waiting out the winter amid the mournful howling of the coyotes, the colonists read agricultural literature, they wrote letters home, they kept journals, they debated God's existence. You have to, if you're Jewish, you gotta debate. And they questioned the fate of capitalism while singing, mending harnesses, and honing tools. In the February thaw, they cleared out more land of stones. They plowed, planted oats, corn, alfalfa, and wheat, cross-hatched marks deeply into the earth so they would prevent soil erosion when the rains came. As more families arrived, the new men took to the fields while others started building homes. By late spring, sprouts appeared in the fields with a promise of a good crop. Well, if cities are schools of hard knocks, farm lessons are lessons in harder rocks. All they had was rocks. Strong winds, dust storms, extreme heat, dry wells, lack of water, and swarms of mosquitoes plagued those farmers. The prized tractor was difficult to maintain, costly to repair. Managing water was another unending challenge and frustration. There is no water out there, you know. To store water for livestock, Isaac Herbst oversaw the construction of a concrete cistern. They made the cistern, but apparently they didn't make it strong enough. They had to go into the canyon wall. They thought it worked. They attached a faucet, a filtration system. They covered the top, and when the cement cured, they really celebrated by filling up the cistern. Only several nights later, the colonists were awakened by a loud rumble. Built with inferior cement and lacking reinforcing rods, one unsupported wall was blown to the ground and shattered. The precious water spilled out and saturated the ground. When the Paiute Canal was finally brought closer to the colony, the expected winter was late. Water was late in coming. It flowed for a week, covered 1/3 of the fields, and then disappeared. Whether the canal could not contain the volume of water needed, had not been sufficiently settled, was poorly constructed, weakened by burrowing animals, or leached in transit, the necessary repairs left the colony without a drop of water for 33 days. Fearful of losing more crops, Brown telegraphed the Board of Land Commissioners and the Sevier Valley Canal Company for help. Admittedly, the new farmers were unskilled in irrigation techniques, but 2 days of enough water to irrigate the entire 1,500 acres was simply not enough. What did grow was barely enough to pay for the seeds. The deficit naturally reacted adversely on the spirit of all of us, Brown said. There were accusations of, I told you so, it wasn't going to work. People had lost confidence in him. And yet Brown continued. He traveled on to Salt Lake City for support. And early on, the city's philanthropic Jewish leaders, and you mentioned many of them, they created an organization called the Utah Colonization Fund that became a holding company for the Clarion Securities. Brown was told, go peddle these bonds, and he did. Samuel Newhouse, who you saw, he bought bonds. Auerbach, who you saw, he bought bonds. Simon Bamberger, the first Democrat and only Jewish governor, he donated $2,000 worth of lumber to build the homes. They got another loan, they got another reprieve. Clarion looked forward to another season with a different caveat. This time, they divided the land into individual farms. It was not to be communal, but everyone would be able to have their own farm. When we first arrived, our home was not yet completed, so we were all crowded together, 2 adults and 6 children, in temporary and crudely built shacks on 2 small rooms, Harry wrote. Our furniture hadn't arrived. We slept on the floor using blankets and pillows my fathers had purchased, but with few exceptions, there was a cooperative spirit among the colonists. They gave their time, they pooled their skills and the experience to aid one another whenever necessary. When the 4-room wood frame houses with gabled roofs and brick chimneys, you can see a picture of it, were finally built on concrete foundations, the Bernstein children regarded them as the epitome of luxury. Of course, the kid who's talking about it, he had slept on the top of a trunk. He still slept on top of a trunk because there were so many kids in the house and didn't get a bedroom. But he said these newer homes had central heating. That is, he said, they had a wood-burning stove in the kitchen. To get water, Pa would take a barrel or a hogshead, put it on the wagon, drive down to the Sevier River and fill it with river water. He'd put it outside the kitchen door and cover it with a wooden cover. In winter, Mother would crack the ice in the barrel, heat water on the stove, and pour it into a wash basin for us to successfully climb in to bathe. It was a Friday night ritual, he said. Before the colony built its school in 1913, everyone went to the nearby town of Centerfield. They loved going there. They were with Mormons and non-Mormons. It was really good. Clarion wanted to have its own school, so they all returned. A school was built. One of the teachers at the school in Centerfield became a teacher in Clarion, and they loved him dearly. It was a fabulous, I'm trying to rush a little, fabulous building. It was also used for religious reasons or non-religious reasons, whatever you wanted. People went to school because it was so cold that David Bernstein redesigned his wagon to put a little heater in the middle so the kids would not freeze themselves as they were going to this school. But school was great. Harry said, he was another Bernstein kid, we were eager to learn, so there were few problems among us. For many of the colonists, though, there was a problem. What began in harmony and cooperation degenerated into bitter feuding when the program of Jewish education was considered. Dissension and debate can only be understood in the context of the ideological diversity that pervaded the Jewish immigrant world. Everybody was so willing to talk and share their thoughts, it was sometimes hard to come to a final solution. I shouldn't say that word after we talk. Come to a common solution. Nationalists emphasized the Jewish identity taught by teacher who understood Yiddish language, tradition, and text. Radicals required students to understand the basics of socialism. Hebrew rights and services were essential for more religious Jews. Others were satisfied with the school board's choice of a Mormon teacher coming from Centerfield. Others did not like that. Compromises were made. Not everybody was happy. But the men worked. I have 2 more pages. Mrs. Bernstein left a kosher home. Her picture's there. Beautiful home, beautiful family to go out there. She tried, she was not religious, but she tried to remain as religious as one can in a place that is not really very religious. She kept a tidy home. She attended to an income-producing garden. She took care of farm animals, raised chickens, milked cows, hauled water, cooked, washed, and mended clothes. She did everything. Even when getting pregnant, they would go to Gunnison, make the round trip to go to Gunnison. She was scrupulously clean. The boys loved it. They would go into the gardens. They would eat. One kid said, pull up fresh turnip, wipe off the soil with our hands, and eat it raw, with relish. Another person said, loved going to the Mormon-owned orchards, because they had plum trees. He said, we ate plum jelly, plum jam, canned plums to our heart's delight, probably went to the bathroom a whole lot. Boys remembered Clarion as an adventure from day to night. After completing school lessons and farm chores, life became an excitement that more than made up for any physical deprivations that such a life leads to. They went on hay rides, they rode horseback. They did stuff, you think, this Jewish kid is out there like a cowboy. And they were. They grew strong, they grew tough, they grew independent. In the summer of 1913, and I'll end it here, I guess, 2,400 acres of land were greening when suddenly the sky darkened, rain clouds appeared, anticipation turned to dread, and Clarion was pummeled, drowned in water, rain. Violent runoff from the valley mountains and water-engorged canals drowned the sprouting fields. One tragedy happened after another. Aaron Binder, who was a farmer, they loved him. He died. He was up in the high mountains harvesting logs. He put them in his wagon. The logs turned over as he was coming down, fell on him, killed him. He's buried in the cemetery there. You'll have to go and find it. Later, his son was buried, barely born and already buried. And then there was this Mr. Bernstein who was so incredible with his children. He got gangrene. They didn't know how to treat it. He went out of town and he died. In time, the colonists left. They left. In 1915, more settlers had arrived, but many more left. By 1920, it was gone. It was over. Despite all the calamities and the disappointments they suffered, they had integrated with the land to rigorous labor. These pioneers were already accustomed to the West. They rode wild, almost unbroken horses bravely as their fathers had been doing it all their lives. Today, Clarion is a fragment of history. Its land still lies fallow, but the memories of Jewish farmers adapting to a new world, learning a new language, taking great risks, and earning a new life, those memories remain today.
Well, I appreciate all the presenters for wonderful presentations, stayed right within the limits of time, didn't have to get the hook or anything. So we've got a few minutes for questions, if you have some. I'm going to ask the presenters to come to the front, if you would, and I will try to call on you to, if you have some questions. So let's begin. Please.
So is the Spiegel family that was here in Utah connected?
Siegel?
Siegel or
Siegel.
Siegel, okay. It sounded like Spiegel when it came out.
Different
Okay,
family.
never mind.
In the back, please.
Let me do two questions.
Okay. I'll answer one.
One for you and one for you.
I really will.
I have some good friends in Ogden
Yeah.
who are the children of Italian immigrants. Did you run into any Italian communities when you did your
You want
work?
to speak to that?
That's my question for you, and then let me just let you think about this one. I also have some friends here in Salt Lake. One friend who is a survivor of the Holocaust who moved here. Did Salt Lake attract a number of people from Holocaust survivors? That was my question, because I have run into a couple of them, and I didn't know whether Salt Lake was a magnet for that. So Italians.
So we actually relied on word of mouth a lot. We sent out a call, and unfortunately, we only had one Italian family respond. And we really relied on referrals to really do this. And so we interviewed one Italian family, and that was all, which made me sad. We put in the research, we tried really hard to find Italian families to interview, and we only found one.
So that's a hope for the future.
Yes, it is.
You know,
Holocaust.
I was gonna let Eileen answer.
well,
this.
also speaking of the Italians, I'm working on a story now about the Italian in the mines in Heber, where a lot of Italians were involved with baseball as young kids, the American Legion. That would be fabulous. So,
Sarah is our curator at Special Collections, and she
She was gonna say something.
Well, I was going to say, we did a POW program a few years ago with the Italian POWs at camp at Ogden. And for that, we got about 15 Italian families coming forward and talking about not only the Italian POWs, but also coming to Ogden and sort of their story of why they were there.
the Jewish the survivors of the Holocaust, we've been trying to interview them before many of them are dying. So we have several interviews with them. They came not as they would to the East Coast, because the East Coast was like family, but they did come here. There were many maybe 18 families had come here. In Ogden, as we said, down in Salt Lake. Reasons for coming are really varied. Some is because of families who lived out here. Others were looking for a place to go. Also, they had people who would help them. And Utah Jewish community was very helpful with a lot of the Holocaust survivors.
One that I know is one of the hidden children. You're familiar with that
There was,
group?
well, I know.
Well, one that I know, it
Do you know
was.
the name?
Oh, are you talking about,
Oh, you mean Anna?
no,
Oh my gosh. Yeah, what's her name?
Nomi Mattis?
Well, we know no.
Yes,
Okay.
no, I mean
But
that.
Ogden has a wonderful survivor. I've written about her. She would love to, you could interview her. She survived. It's amazing, as a young child. She was beaten up by Gestapo teachers. I mean, she survived. Her story is incredible. She lives in Ogden with her family. She's going to be in my new book, but she has stories that you would really like. One man who died a couple of years ago made me very sad. Spiegel.
Oh, that's. who
Harry
might be
Spiegel.
on
No,
front.
Harry Spiegel was a Holocaust survivor. He made watches. This man was a hidden child, but he was not hidden by somebody else. He was hiding by his father, who was so damn smart that he knew, though they were all corralled into the small tenement building, if he found a place down in the basement where he could stay, knowing that he could cut the wires to the fence that was, barbed wire to the fence that was nearby, he actually escaped, and he kept ahead of the Nazis each time. His story would bring you to tears.
Yeah.
He was a kid who couldn't, he was told so often not to talk, not to say a word, kills me. Because I
Yeah,
love
well,
it.
I became.
Is it the Marriott collection, aren't
Well, I
some of these
haven't-
interviews in the Marriott collection?
His story isn't,
Oh.
no.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
And I just want to say that he actually took
Yeah.
him weeks and months before he could speak above a whisper, because he hid out the whole time.
I became fascinated with this when I did some work back at the Holocaust Museum.
Yes.
And looked at some of the survivor stories and so on. And then I became curious when I ran into a few people here in Salt Lake. And I just wondered the degree to which it was.
Actually, Noemi came here later.
Yeah, she did. And I don't know that her choice, I think she came to Utah more for professional reasons, at
Yes,
least her
yes.
Well,
husband.
yeah, the university though.
The
university,
They
yeah.
had a quota on Jews for a long time.
Yes, they
During
did.
the war and after, so that might have been a reason, it might not have been a reason. Any more?
Other questions, comments, please, Connie?
This is a real prosaic question, but did they lose the land? They were not able to pay off the 10-year note?
Well, they, you know what it is, in fact, I have this, I was so lucky. You know, when you start to research, people just call you, it's just so amazing. Like from Maryland, I started to talk about the Bernstein family, and I never even knew and got all these calls, I was really thrilled. Yes, they lost all the land. They couldn't afford it, they couldn't pay for it. But some people, like, do you know Maurice Warshaw?
Yeah.
Well, he was there.
He was a child.
He was a child.
And he
then-
went on to found the supermarket chain,
Supermarket.
which eventually was sold to Smith's.
And then I got a call from someone in Maine who said that Benjamin Brown's son, which is another story I won't tell you, but he was 100 years old. He just died maybe 3 years ago, and he took that whole the whole thing about chickens and the co-ops, and he brought it all the way up from New York to Maine. Clarion really exists in a lot of people's minds.
And I will say something about Benjamin Brown, because that's, I researched his life after Clarion, and after he set up a Northwestern Poultry Association here, and did trade with the East. He actually moved back east, and in the 1930s, he started a cooperative farm and an industrial
That's what
a
it's
manufacturing
so-
site in New Jersey, which was successful. And so he died tragically. I think he might have had some kind of mental illness. So even though Clarion failed, he did go on to have a successful cooperative venture in the 1930s and that went on into the 1950s in New Jersey.
But Benjamin Brown's son, possibly his illegitimate son, which is another story, but he was the one who followed in his father's footsteps. And he took this co-op all the way up.
And Benjamin Brown did have an illegitimate child at Clarion, which was one reason for dissension.
So when I wasn't going there, I sort of said it, and I said, I wanted to leave it at that, because the man did so much good.
Question?
Yes. Someone mentioned something about Brigham Young and the miners. Did he have an attitude about mining?
Oh,
yes.
Oh, yeah.
Guaranteed.
Tell us more about that.
Well, and probably people in the audience can answer that better than I can, but
Thank you.
from what I've read, he really felt that the only suitable vocation for Mormons was agriculture, and that's what allowed Gentiles to come in and fill like a void, and mining he just thought mining would bring in unsavory elements, which actually it did.
Well, he didn't want the transcontinental railroad coming into Salt Lake, so we had it up in Ogden. He didn't want more interference by non-Mormon people. People went to Corinne to sell, and there were some Mormon stores there because they were smart. There were some Mormon stores, but they went there because they were losing their business in Salt Lake City. Do you remember seeing that? There was the all-seeing eye above the stores?
Yes. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, that's why. If you could go into a store that you knew was Mormon-owned, but if it was not Mormon-owned, you couldn't go in, they'd pull you out.
But if anyone here knows anything
Yeah, well,
more.
my father worked for Kennecott for 17 years and was interested in mining besides. The attitude Brigham Young had was that miners had an alternate lifestyle, that's the best way to put it. They had women who followed the camps. It was a prostitution ring essentially. So they had mostly single men there with women who were, even if they were just doing the laundry and whatever, there was something else going on the side. Well, this is not the lifestyle Brigham wanted. And so he said, make sure that you can eat first and we'll worry about that other stuff, because Bingham Canyon's wealth was found by a Mormon and Brigham told him to leave it alone. So that's part of it, and the governor's mansion is actually a miner's mansion. Jesse Knight's, I think.
Oh.
Thomas Kearns, yeah,
Thomas
Thomas Kearns,
Kearns.
but it's still a mining connection. And that, it's the mining
You
industry.
would say Bingham City, Bingham Canyon?
Bingham
Canyon was a melting pot. It had
Yeah.
more diversity there than in the entire United States, all in this little canyon, this
Yeah.
little narrow
But the
canyon.
original mineral found was by a Mormon whose last name was Bingham, and that's where it came from.
Other questions?
But I think that the Mormon battalion that went to California with the mining there found the same trouble, and Brigham kept telling my ancestors, come back to Utah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eventually they did, and they lost all the money anyway.
You know, I think there was a certain amount of control going on in terms of his decisions that were being made. He didn't want things that would risk splitting the community.
Yeah.
Like, he'd be very flexible, he could change his mind. And he did change his mind, but it was a lot going on in that period of time. Other questions? Anyone that hasn't had a chance wants to ask one? Okay.
I'll ask another one for anybody that might be able to, and this is actually one I didn't get answered in another session, but this group I think is qualified. It has to do with topaz, and it has to do with the Japanese that remained in Utah afterwards. And I just wondered, I taught quite a number of the children of incarceration camps survivors. And almost without exception, they had been at the Minnetonka camp up in Idaho, not Topaz. And I wondered if Topaz people chose to leave the state and go elsewhere, as opposed to the people in Idaho chose to come to Salt Lake. I just found that very intriguing, that I would have expected Topaz, but I
The
didn't.
majority of the people who were in the Topaz camps were actually from California.
Right.
As soon as they had the ability to leave,
They went back to California. But the Minnetonka people I knew were also from California.
Did not
And
leave.
Lorraine,
Lorraine's
yeah.
father was in.
Yeah, my dad's family were relocated from Berkeley.
Right.
And when his family left, they were given, everybody was given $25 in a one-way ticket. And so they lost their dry goods store and their home and everything, so they went up to Salt Lake because there was an established Japantown. It was here actually from the late 1800s.
That's right, there was.
And so his family lived in the Imperial Hotel, which, if you look west towards the Salt Palace's entrance, it was really,
Right.
Imperial Hotel was right on that corner,
Okay.
right there.
I think I've seen pictures of that.
There were quite a few people that, from Topaz that stayed
That
here
did
in
stay.
Utah.
Okay, then that was probably more
But a lot of them,
coincidence.
when they were able to establish themselves, some of them did move back. I mean, when I was growing up, I remember him always saying, at some point in time, I want to go back to Berkeley, but,
Yeah.
by the time you have kids, you end up staying.
Were the people from Minnetonka from different places? The ones I knew were from California. But,
They were actually from the Pacific Northwest.
From the
because one of
Northwest,
my mother's friends, my mother was born and raised here, so she was here, from her father came from the early 1900s and settled here.
Brandon Uno was in Ogden.
I was actually, that's what I was.
Oh, do you want to say that?
No, go ahead. Well, Lorrie interviewed Raymond Uno before I came on board. Lorrie?
Yeah, yes.
Raymond Uno.
Raymond Uno, yes.
Yeah, so she interviewed him before I came on board. Do you have any?
Oh, what was the, I'm sorry. What was the I was talking to Kaplan.
Raymond Uno was born, he was born in Ogden, but during the Depression, his father couldn't handle, lost his store, moved to
Right,
California.
he went back to California, and from there, they were interred into the Heart Mountain,
Right.
Wyoming. And his father ended up dying while they were there. He was there for 3 years, and then, like you said, $25 and a one-way ticket to wherever you wanted to go. And they ended up, he never really settled in Ogden. No, that was Watt. They start to get lost.
Yeah.
No, he stayed in Ogden.
As a railroad, he worked as a gangster dancer for the railroad.
His His father?
No,
No, he might have. He ended up becoming a judge.
Yeah.
Raymond did.
I'm sitting there.
Does he?
looking at the big
Okay.
sword.
Yeah.
I get, see, I get lost
Oh, wait a
with
minute, I
Watt
have
and
this.
Raymond. They talked on the same day. I actually wasn't there for Raymond. Sarah was there.
Raymond's father died in the camps, and Raymond said to me, because he was over at my house a little while ago, and he said, when it was over, he said, you split up our family. We couldn't eat together. We barely slept together.
Right.
The family became shattered. Losing a father and then having the mother having to work all these jobs. She worked at a Methodist boarding house or something.
Right across the street.
Struggling through that. And he was wild. He was a wild boy. He did everything. And then he realized he needed to have an education. He said something that you said similar about where he said, we have to give everybody a chance. We have to give everybody a chance. That's why these interviews are so important. People forget that we are so many different people. You know, you can collect things as Mormons are here, but the Mormons are here. They're all independent. They're all different. Jews are all different. Japanese are all different. But unless we start to understand the differences, we'll never get this world together. Blacks couldn't own land, couldn't buy a house in the area where I live in Sugar House. They couldn't buy a house. They had to go to the west side. So there's a lot to learn. Okay.
Our time is over for this session, but you can tell this is a topic that will continue to be discussed. Thank you for being here. Thanks again to our presenters.